Hi guys, welcome back to The Social Tune, and on today's episode of a Record Roundup, we come face to face with a number of new albums that have been causing some buzz. Some have been well received, some have been utterly trashed, and I had pretty clear expectations for all of them. I also wasn't really planning on covering any of them, but the requests just kept on coming. Well, all except for one, but we'll get to that in a bit. Instead, let's start off by reviewing the newest album by The National.
The day I die, where will we be? The day I die, the day I die, where will we be?
My relationship with this band is a bit of a weird one. For as much as I do appreciate and admire their music, it did take me a while to find an album of theirs that I truly did love. Don't get me wrong, I really liked Trouble Will Find Me, but I didn't really love it in the same way a lot of their fans seem to. Their only album that I can really call excellent is Boxer from 2007. But even then, it wouldn't be until 2015 that I found an album of theirs that I truly adored. That being Return to the Moon by Elvi, where Matt Berninger teamed up with Brent Knopf of Menomina and Ramona Falls to deliver easily my favorite album from him to date. It is excellent. And the best thing about that album was that it gave Matt Berninger's voice great melody lines that worked really well. Sure, The National's music has a groove and a bass line to it, but it can occasionally feel a little too hazy and swampy. So when I heard that this album was going to feature more prominent melodies in its instrumentation, I had no problem with that. So I went into Sleep Well Beast hoping for the best. And to be honest, while I have heard mixed reviews for this album, I'm honestly falling on the positive side. Okay, it's not great and it's not as good as their last album, but there are still some pretty solid ideas here that are fairly well executed. The album basically centers around a failing marriage and the struggle our protagonist goes through while faced with it. And what I really appreciated about it was how, in true National fashion, our protagonist is very flawed. He does not treat this breakup lightly, and he regularly acts like a huge douchebag. And yet through that angry facade, you can see a lot of hurt seep through. Of course you have the excellently framed fear of loneliness on Day I Die, the drunken anger on I'll Still Destroy You, where our protagonist brings their kids into it, raising the stakes. But while the instrumentation on both of those songs, and most of these to be honest, is pretty great, it can feel a little too simplistic. And I could honestly say the same for our protagonist, who, despite all of his flaws, doesn't learn his lesson by the end of this album, as it's proved on the next to last song, Dark Side of the Gym, where he's just being selfish. The real problem is that our protagonist is a tad too unlikable, and because of that, I didn't find myself enjoying this album in the same way I could have. But the most detracting part of this album, by far, is the political elements. Yes, I'm aware that populism is part of The National's appeal, and you could potentially integrate it into this story. The problem is, they're not, instead feeling tacked on merely for relevance. Which frustrates me because with a little fine-tuning, this album could have been one of the best of the year. But as it is, it's still a light 7 out of 10. It may not be great, but it is really good. It's recommended by me, for what that's worth.
Saw the way she looked me in my eyes. She said, baby, I am not afraid to die.
Oh, why do you people hate me? Seriously, I did not want to cover this, and not for the reasons you may think. No, the main reason is that I was perfectly happy remaining impartial on Lil Uzi Vert. All year, I've seen people argue that he's deep and meaningful and talented, or that he's one of the worst artists currently on the charts. But for me, I really don't care. On the one hand, I think his verse on Bad and Bougie is awful, but on the other hand, I don't hate EXO Tour Life in the same way so many other people seem to. And sure, I don't think the guy's that talented, but on the other hand, from what I've seen outside of his music, he does seem like a really nice guy, as he has a sense of humor and he doesn't seem to mind what kind of a reaction his music gets. What I'm saying is, I'd rather check out an entire project from Lil Uzi Vert than even one track from Kodak Black. But if I reviewed his actual music, it would mean that I'd have to look at him in a critical light and potentially piss off a lot of his fans. But hey, like I said, I don't hate EXO Tour Life, and it appears on this album, so maybe the rest of the songs would fall into the same vein, right? Well, frankly, no, they don't. In fact, if you're looking for an album with some of the worst production and lack of ideas that I've heard in 2017, this would be it. Because yeah, no way around it, this album is pretty terrible. Pretty much every single track here is unfocused lyrically and incredibly cliched, which doesn't help the monotonous feel of this album any more than the actual instrumentation, which is often swamped in autotune and extremely by the numbers. This of course means that on pretty much every single song here, Lil Uzi Vert is slurring his words and is barely comprehensible. But you know what, for as much as I do hate that incomprehensible slurring, at least it's just generic. No, the real issue comes on 444 plus 222, which is easily one of the worst songs that I've heard all year, as it tries to take potshots at Jay-Z and fails spectacularly, mainly due to one of the worst choruses I've ever heard, no joke. But believe it or not, this album is saved from being as god-awful as it could have been by a couple of songs that I do find myself liking. For as boring as Unfazed is, at least The Weeknd brings some charisma to the table, and for as unfocused and off-topic as EXO Tour Life can get, at least it tried for something grander and somewhat succeeded. The real surprise here is that there are songs here that aren't just meh like those tracks, but that are actually good. Yes, really. The Way Life Goes sounds like something Big Sean could do in his sleep, but it is fairly good and it does feel grounded. Neon Guts with Pharrell is certainly a highlight, especially with that chorus. And believe it or not, I actually really like For Real. I mean, yeah, it's repetitive and dumb, but his inflections on that track were honest to God charismatic and funny to me. But still, that's 3 songs out of 16, and it's nowhere near enough to counteract all the bad. Hell, all the decent songs put together wouldn't make up for 444 plus 222. God, I hate that song. So in the end, this was a chore to get through, plain and simple. It's not the worst thing that I've heard all year, but it's up there. So it's a light 4 out of 10, and I now have to live with the fact that I'm no longer neutral on this guy. As predicted, I'm getting no joy from that fact. Thanks, guys.
Every detail, but I do. From your blue jeans to your shoes, girl, that night was just like you, unforgettable.
This has been one of my most dreaded releases of 2017. Ever since I first heard this guy on Crash and Burn in 2015, I have loathed him, and his album Tangled Up did not help that, as it landed on my top 5 worst albums of that year. But still, since then, I'll admit he's been a little more tolerable. Sure, T-Shirt was god-awful, but at least Die a Happy Man and his subsequent singles were pretty decent. But all that could change at the drop of a hat, so I braced myself and dived into this. And oh boy, was it a mixed bag. Seriously, this was a weird listen with some decent songs, some meh ones, and some bad ones that balanced out to a perfect meh. Let me break down for you exactly how this album progresses. Tracks 1 through 5 are songs I like. 6 through 9 are varying levels of awful, as is track 11, and all the others are boring, bland, and forgettable. See, it's really weirdly structured, almost as if it were done on purpose. Easily the most consistent element on this album is Thomas Rhett himself, who, with the exception of Leave Right Now and When You Look Like That, is more likable here than he's ever been before, with a pretty solid vocal performance which he tends to stick in really well. Even though his dad joining in with him on Drink a Little Beer does highlight just how unimpressive they both are as singers, the production is also a mixed bag here, as it's honestly fine on most of this album, except when it goes colossally wrong. Right around the time where I was thinking, this isn't so bad at the end of Marry Me, Leave Right Now comes in with some of the ugliest and blockiest production that I've heard on a country song since Tangled Up. The title track is stilted in every way, and the rubbery effects on Smooth Like the Summer really did annoy me. And speaking of a mixed bag, the lyrics. Like I said before, the first 5 tracks on this album are genuinely good. Sure, Craving You only barely features Maren Morris as she's shoved right to the back of the mix, but it's still a decent song that's well written. 16 is a great song about growing up, which is predictable but charming in its own way. And hell, Marry Me is one of the best songs I've ever heard from Thomas Rhett, about a guy who's at a wedding toasting the bride and groom while regretting that he never told the bride just how much he loved her. And while he certainly is bitter, he does end up doing the mature thing and letting her go by the end. Unfortunately, that's balanced out by songs like Kiss Me Like a Stranger, where he's asking this girl to kiss him like it's their first time. I mean, if you went around kissing random strangers, how do you think you'd both feel? Also, you're implying that you're kind of sick of the way she's kissing you now, so no, this is nowhere near as sexy as you think. Or of course When You Look Like That, where he says, how do you expect me to keep my hands off you when you look like that? Which maybe calls for some serious charges. So overall, I'm giving this a solid 5 out of 10, which may not be spectacular, but it's better than I expected. Again, there are some really good songs here. Thomas Rhett seems to be moving in the right direction. But I still can't fully support this, not until Thomas Rhett gets his act together and starts thinking for more than a second about his lyrics and beats.
A cup of coffee, smoke in my hand, another day in the life of a guitar man. La da da.
I always feel I should like Kip Moore a lot more than I actually do. Compared to most of his mainstream contemporaries, he's at least trying to bring more of a rock stomp and groove to his music, but despite some pretty solid melodies, he often falls a little short in terms of his content. Not that it's bad, but it does feel pretty generic. But again, what does make him appealing, even to me, is his roots and rock approach to country music. And this album is the absolute pinnacle of that. There's a lot of Bruce Springsteen influence here, from the instrumentation to Kip Moore's own delivery. And let me stress, this is not a bad thing. In fact, I'd say that this is one of Kip Moore's better albums, where the country elements take a back seat to Americana and roots music that honestly reminded me a little of a less refined War on Drugs album. And I will say that the instrumentation is pretty damn potent, with plenty of rough guitars and drums that have a great sizzle to them, with Kip Moore's voice fitting extremely well over all of it. Even on the songs that don't work all that well, his instrumentation and vocals really do pull through. However, once again, what holds this album back from being better are its writing and content. See, while the instrumentation is very reminiscent of Americana, rock, and roots music, the lyrics are written much more in a country vein, and unfortunately, it's pretty cliched. You have some relationship songs, some breakup songs, some songs about hooking up, and unfortunately, it's barely ever interesting. The hooks are okay, but nothing to write home about except when they're bad. More Girls Like You is one of the worst examples of this, as he's telling this girl that he wants to take her home and fuck her to make more girls like her, which is profoundly creepy. Again, a lot of these songs are about women, and it really does get tiring after a while. Still, the album does end on a high note with Guitar Man, which is easily one of the best songs I've ever heard from Kip Moore. I love songs like this and The Driver from last year, exploring stock characters that we may think of, and it really does end the album on a high note. And along with really good instrumentation and a pretty great vocal performance, I ultimately think that this is worthy of an extremely light 7 out of 10. It's a really good album, but Kip Moore still has a long way to go before I can fully endorse him. I do believe that he can get there though, so to you, sir, I say keep on trying. Okay, out of all the albums here, this is the one that I got the fewest requests to cover. In fact, the only person who requested this to me was a friend at work who constantly sends me weird music. And while most of that music sucks, don't worry, he knows it does, this band really did strike me. A comedic Los Angeles-based band who specialize in creating extremely camp and over-the-top glam metal. And they play into those 80s stereotypes hard, which could potentially annoy certain fans of the genre. But personally, as a huge fan of glam rock and metal, I absolutely love this band. So I decided to look up their past discography and discovered that they actually dropped an album back in March of this year. Perfect opportunity, and I was definitely going to take it. And yeah, this album is wonderful. As you'd expect from the title, it's not pushing the bar or really anything different from their other albums. Hell, if anything, this is them at their most restrained. But it's still a ton of fun, wildly insensitive, graphic as hell, and utterly hilarious. And let me be clear, all of that is intentional. This album really does feel like it was pulled from another age, so much so that it actually features a cover of Cheap Trick's She's Tight, which I absolutely adored until I realized just how similar it was to the original. I mean, it's a faithful cover, but it really doesn't bring anything new to the table other than more of a sexual tone to the lyrics. Still, I can't deny that the song really does have a groove, as do all of the songs really. When I say that this feels like it was pulled from another age, I mean it, because the hooks are ridiculously sticky and the riffs go on for days. The best example of this is probably Walk of Shame, which lyrically is in the same vein as Brad Paisley and Mick Jagger's Drive of Shame earlier this year, except that the instrumentation is cranked up to 11 with thundering drums, an incredible guitar solo, and some harmonica touches that fondly reminded me of some of my favorite Beatles songs. What makes Steel Panther stand out from those older bands, though, is its filthy content, which gets pretty damn explicit. There's a song on here where the chorus literally goes, "That's when you came in and blew me," repeating the phrase twice before adding a cheeky "away" after the last one. And yeah, some people could potentially criticize this for being sexist. But to be fair, all of the prominent women portrayed on this album are gold diggers and harlots, especially on songs like That's When You Came In and Wasted So Much Time. The latter of which has our frontman leaving this girl who he's wasted so much time fucking because ultimately she'll never accept who he really is. Plus, they do pay tribute to women everywhere and how they need to be treated special on the blatantly titled Pussy Ain't Free, so what's the problem? Pair the hilarious content with the incredibly sticky hooks on songs like Anything Goes, I Got What You Want, and especially Wrong Side of the Tracks parentheses Out in Beverly Hills, and you have easily one of the best rock albums that I've heard all year. I'm head over heels for this album. It plays to an aesthetic that we really don't get enough of nowadays. Guys, if you have a sense of humor, please take the time to check this out, because to me, it's well worth it, getting a strong 8 out of 10. Awesome job, Steel Panther. So glad that I finally discovered you. And that's it for this episode. More record roundup coming up next, followed by something that I'm actually really excited for you guys to see. We'll see how it turns out. Either way, leave a like if you enjoyed and post in the comments what other albums you'd like me to check out in the future. Either that, or tweet them at me at the Social Tune, link in the description. Please subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and until the next time, I'm Finn, and this is the Social Tune, signing off.